have held me in your arms, in my head. I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
Hello, and you are very welcome to the latest episode of the Attic Sessions. And today we have a very special focus on fiction, and we're delighted to be joined by two leading practitioners in the field, Tanya Farrelly and Mary Morrissy. Thanks very much for coming along. Tanya has 2 books to date, a collection of short stories called When Black Dogs Sing, which was published by Ireland House in 2016, and a novel titled The Girl Behind the Lens, which was published by HarperCollins also in 2016. She's been shortlisted for the Francis McManus and Hennessy Awards, and a 3rd book is due out in April 2018. We'll talk about that in a little while. Mary Morrissy's most recent publication is a short story collection called Prosperity Drive, which was published by Jonathan Cape, also in 2016, and a previous collection of short stories, Lazy Eye, appeared in 1993. And she's also published 3 novels, Mother of Pearl, The Pretender, and The Rising of Bella Casey. She's won many prestigious awards for her writing, including a Hennessy Award and a Lannan Literary Foundation Award. So I always like to ask guests how this whole adventure started, how you got into writing. So, and Tanya, summer I read when I was doing my extensive research that you had been writing stories since childhood.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I've been writing since I was probably about 5 years old. I always loved writing stories, and I've always been an avid reader. So I would see my writing as an extension of reading, really. I always loved English at school. I mean, if the homework was to write an essay or to write a short story, that wasn't homework for me. That was something to enjoy, you know.
And were the stories were you rewriting things that you'd read, or were they
No, original stories. Yeah.
Because I was the first woman for rewriting the endings of things.
Okay.
And I was putting
improving
myself,
them.
Well, no, I was putting myself into them, but I was always like the helpful friend or the person that would put them right, rather than anything else. So keeping that going, because a lot of us have these sort of instincts when we're kids, and then they kind of get beaten out of us,
right?
In a way. Like, how did you manage to keep going with the writing?
I suppose I didn't keep it going all through those years. I mean, there was probably a number of years when I didn't write, but certainly I was always interested in it, and I always read. And, you know, my school holidays, I'd come out with big bundles of books in the library, and, you know, my mother always bought me a lot of books. She wasn't particularly a reader herself, but because she knew how much I loved reading, she fed that habit, if you like. So I suppose I got serious about writing then when I was about 20 or 21. I started looking around and asking in the local library if there was maybe a writers group that I could join. And I grew up in Clondalkin, and there wasn't a whole lot going on then in Clondalkin. And I was then told that there was a writers group in Tala Library, which I joined, and I spent 5 years as part of that group. And that really, I suppose, it taught me a lot. And yeah, I just kept going ever since that, actually. There was a bit of an interruption because I went to university quite late to do my degree. I was 23 when I actually went back. I was working full time. I studied at night. That did interfere with my writing.
Sure.
I'd kind of been doing really well. Like, say, when I was 23, I'd been shortlisted for the Francis McManus and the Hennessy and a few other competitions. So I was really on track at that stage. But then I started doing an English degree at night, and I decided, okay, if I want to get good results out of this degree, something's got to give. And then I followed that up with a master's. So I actually stopped writing for 4 years. And that was hard, you know, because I had all these ideas and things that I wanted to do, but I didn't have the time to do them because of working full time and studying at night. So by the time I finished the master's then, I decided, okay, now was the time. I'm not going to let anything else interfere with my writing. And I've been writing ever since.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Mary, I think did you come to it through journalism? Am I right in thinking?
I came through it through journalism, but in a kind of a roundabout way. I mean, unlike Tanya, I was a kind of a journeyman writer when I was a child. I wrote and somebody asked me to produce something, but otherwise I didn't have an ambition to write, or it wasn't really part of, I suppose, the culture that I grew up in to have an ambition to be a writer. It just wasn't, you know, we had, from my family, we had ambitions to be primary school teachers or civil servants, you know.
Sensible things.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Pensionable jobs, I think they're known as.
Exactly. So, but I was interested in journalism, and the year I left school, I did a correspondence course in journalism, which now just sounds so kind of old-fashioned, that, you know, you used to get these, you know, assignments through the post in a big brown envelope, and you did all of your assignments, and then you put them back in a brown envelope and sent them off, and then you would get what I thought were very, very paltry remarks from your tutor. And my tutor had, you'll probably be interested in this,
Well,
because
I'm
you're
not-
looking at it from the other side.
Well, you're describing my current job, really, which is with the Open University, but anyway.
I'm presuming it was a man, although I don't know. His initials were A or E, and, you know, he'd give you a couple of lines, and he was never as enthusiastic as I thought he should be about my writing, my journalism. But the final assignment in the course was to write a short story, and because I was sort of biddable, you know,
Yeah.
I just thought, okay,
do
right,
it.
I'll write one. And, you know, lo and behold, I mean, it produced a response from A or E, which was like gushing. There was half a page saying, you know, is this the first thing you've written? If so, it's very interesting. Have you ever thought about being a writer? And, you know, to be truthful, I hadn't.
Yeah.
So he planted that, I'm presuming,
Yeah.
planted that idea. And it started from that.
So did you continue with journalism while writing on the side? Or?
I went and studied journalism
Yeah.
then in Rathmines.
Yeah.
And I wrote fiction kind of on the side, and a bit like Tanya, you know, I started off really well, you know, and won something in Listowel and had a few stories published in Young Irish
Yeah.
Writing, and then kind of I got a job, and the job took over, and I was on a trip to Australia when I was about 24, and I had let the writing slide a bit, and I thought, really, you know, I had one of those, you know, what am I going to do with my life moments, and I thought, well, you know, if you're going to be a writer, you would really want to stop treating it like some like little hobby and apply yourself to it. So then I started applying myself to it, and then didn't have anything published for about 8 years, you know, and thinking, God, when I cared less, it worked, you know. So that was my sort of trajectory into it.
And I know Tanya, actually, like me, has a PhD in creative writing. You teach postgraduate creative writing in UCC. So I'm wondering about that academic experience, both as a student and as a teacher. Has it created a more controlled environment, if you like, for creative writers? I'm thinking of something Martin Malone said to us the other week about how, as an editor of a magazine, he can see, you know, there's a lot of really good quality writing there that is clearly, you know, the benefit of people doing courses. Is it institutionalizing writing at all, do you think?
Well, I have, you know, I do have reservations about creative writing in the academic setting. I mean, I suppose partly because I don't have an academic background, and I just wonder about, you know, putting creative writers through that kind of academic ringer, just the system, you know, grading creativity, like how do you do that? And
you wrote a
know,
fabulous essay on that, there was a book of papers on teaching creative writing in the classroom, and you have an amazing essay on just the oddness of having to put a numerical value to somebody's piece of creative work.
Yes, and you know, I mean, there is, certainly in the US, there's a continuing debate where creative writing has been much longer part of the university setup. You know, that, you know, can you recognise somebody who's been through the MFA ringer and come out the other end? And is there such a thing as like a successful workshop story, which mightn't necessarily appeal outside of that setting?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think these are all dangers. On the other hand, you know, like referring back to my 8 years where I got nothing published, even though I was sending stuff off, you know, I think that this is what the MA here does. It gives you time out. It gives you concentrated attention. You know, you've got like 2 or 3 faculty members whose job it is to look at your writing and try and improve it and, you know, broaden your horizons if that's what you need. And, you know, to stop you making the same mistakes over and over, you know, that sense of when you're a young writer and you're sending your work out into the world, and first of all you have to get over that terrible self-loathing about it. And then it comes back and you've no idea why it's coming back. And I found after that 8 years, or looking back on that 8 years now, I think I can see now what I was doing wrong. And all it needed was for somebody to take me aside and say, perhaps if you did this, or, you know. And when I was at that stage, I was kind of quite secretive about my writing. And it's interesting because I think in the world of journalism, at that stage, in the like late 70s, early 80s, people within journalism, you know, didn't welcome the creative writer. You know, the creative writer was considered like a bit airy-fairy, and, you know, even though now a great deal of writing comes from people with that background. But, you know, at that stage there was that kind of macho thing that the real writing was journalism, you know. And so, you know, I wasn't going around the place declaring I was a writer, you know, because in the world I found myself in, that wasn't like a high status thing, you know. So it had the quality of being like a little secret vice that you nursed at home, but you didn't tell anybody about.
Which is the story they tell about Jane Austen insisting that a door should be kept squeaky in her house because she was the room where she would write, but she kept that quiet, so she'd have her embroidery over her manuscript, and she could hear somebody coming in, so she could proudly put it away. So, like, you know, hiding your writing is a tradition. Can I ask Tanya whether, because my PhD made me very self-conscious.
Okay. I think, just, you know, Mary was talking there about the MA or the MFA in creative writing, and I didn't do my master's in creative writing. I did it in 20th century Irish writing and cultural theory. And I actually regret now that I didn't do an MA in creative writing at the time, when I'd kind of asked for advice from professors, and that they said to me, well, you're better off doing an MA in something that you can get a job in, you know, so that wasn't necessarily doing an MA in creative writing. So, you know, I went straight from that MA into a PhD in creative writing. So I was never in a classroom scenario as regards my writing, you know, because my PhD was distance. I mean, you know,
so
it was all my own work. There were no workshops, there were no classes. It was, you know, the PhD consisted of me writing a novel and doing a dissertation and emailing my work to my supervisor, and him getting back to me and making suggestions and stuff like that.
So almost not a million miles away from the editor-writer relationship.
So, I mean, definitely what it did for me was it gave me the discipline. It gave me the kick on the ass to write the novel and get it done.
Yeah.
So I think definitely it's motivational, and I understand what you're saying about, isn't it a bit odd doing creative writing in an academic setting where somebody's grading writing or whatever, but at the same time, isn't it a wonderful thing to have the opportunity to study creative writing and do that as your subject?
Sure.
You know, because when I finished my master's, I had the idea that I would love to do a PhD, but I wasn't willing to spend another 3 years studying somebody else's work. I just wanted to do my own work. So I think it's a brilliant opportunity.
And I think another thing about the creative writing, to be a kind of a devil's advocate, is that, you know, nobody questions musicians going to the College of Music and doing an apprenticeship,
Or a visual
or an
artist.
artist
Yeah,
going
yeah,
to the
it's
College
true.
of Art.
Absolutely.
It's not considered as some kind of, strange
Yeah.
ritual
Yeah.
that's going to somehow interfere with the art. In fact, certainly, art college is seen as a way of opening people
Yeah.
right up,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
to bigger and better things.
Yeah, no, it's so true, so true.
But it still hangs over creative writing, that notion. I mean, I think of it really more as serving an apprenticeship, doing an apprenticeship
sure,
like
yeah.
under
Yeah.
like a master,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, that I think it's more satisfying to think of it that way
yeah.
than, a kind of an academic
Yeah,
course.
Sure. Now, both of you write both types of fiction. You both write short stories and novels. So I'm just curious about the different disciplines and mental states required for that, because, again, having just sort of attempted my first novel, it feels like running a marathon without necessarily having the muscles to do so,
Yeah.
as opposed to the short story that has that tighter focus. Can you do both at the same time, or are they very different things?
Well, I certainly don't do both at the same time, because when I'm focused on something, I really focus with tunnel vision, and I can't work on something else. I just have to stick with it. I'm glad that I started with short stories, definitely. And I love writing short stories, and certainly I'll never stop that. After this new novel that I'm working on is done, I'm going to write another collection of short stories. That's the plan. But as regards talking about apprenticeships there, writing short stories, I think, is a fabulous apprenticeship for writing the novel. Because, as you say, there's nothing superfluous, or there shouldn't be anything superfluous in a short story. So your writing is so good and tight that I think then when it comes to writing a novel, you'll probably proceed with that same style, hopefully, and there won't be any padding in the novel. There won't be anything there that shouldn't be there, So it's great for honing your writing skills.
And can you do both at the same time?
Short stories and the novel?
Yeah? Like, might you have both on the go?
No. Like I say, I focus on one thing at a time, so I've spent the last, year working on the novel that I'm currently doing, and I haven't really been writing short stories. Yeah.
And Mary, what about your experience? Because there was an early collection of short stories, then 3 novels, and then another collection of short stories.
Yes, and what a joy it was to go back to the short story.
Yeah,
I
I'm
must
looking
say.
forward to it.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's like a treat after the kind of... I compared writing a novel with going down the mines, So you disappear down and you're there shoveling away for, several years,
Yeah.
And, the short story has that wonderful kind of sense of, well, maybe not instant gratification, but, the light at the end of the tunnel is not the oncoming, failure of the novel,
Because they can take a very long time. I remember hearing Claire Keegan say that, it could take 7 or 8 months to just sort of work on one short story, and not even the kind of the very long ones that she can do, but that she just chips away and chips away and chips away and chips away over months. So, they're not instant.
No, they're not instant, but, you can see the end or the destination, I think, of a short story, whereas often with a novel you can't, or else it maybe changes halfway through, or something happens in the writing that changes it, and it's the long trajectory of the novel as opposed to the shorter trajectory of the short story. I mean, I found the transition to writing a novel so painful and difficult because I was so used to writing short. I thought I'll never sustain something over 200 pages. In fact, when I began writing my first unpublished, unfinished novel, I used to go into bookshops and count the number of pages and words in novels, thinking, could I actually write 80,000 words? I don't think so, that has affected the way I write, like a first draft of a novel, very roughly, really to see, is there enough mileage in it to get me to the end of a novel?
Now, you've tried both contemporary fiction, historic fiction. What leads you to the subject matter that you focus on?
Well, I suppose with the novels, they're all, I suppose they're vaguely journalistic in that they're all based on real incidents, you know, and that in a way gives you a kind of a framework for the novel. It's almost like the story is there already. Now, you might not tell it in exactly the same way, but you know, it is a kind of a comfort blanket in a way. And I always think of the short story as being like reports from the contemporary world. Although I have recently tried a few sort of historical short stories just to sort of see, does it work? But
Yeah.
I feel that for me, the short story is about now.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't kind of set out to be a historical novel, but the stories that I was interested in just happened to be historical. So
Yeah. And
that's where I am.
And also a sort of a sense of sort of reclaiming lost voices in a way, because I'm thinking in particular of The Rising of Bella Casey, which talks about Sean O'Casey's sister and a very tragic life, essentially. But she was sort of lost behind the big figure of her brother and her brother's plays. So did you have a sense with that of wanting to sort of reclaim a lost history?
Yes and no. Although the original, you know, impulse to write her story, was I read an academic book just that mentioned her in passing and just talked about this terrible kind of downward spiral of her life, of a very promising start, so a kind of rags to riches in reverse sort of story. And I remember that kind of strange tingling sensation you get when you think, oh, this is mine, you know.
Yeah.
And it was only when I then did more research, I thought, gosh, she really has been written out, you know. And it was a way into her story I mean, originally I had intended it to be her autobiography, you know. But one of the problems about that was that, you know, people don't know a great deal about O'Casey's life, and he's not as much in the popular imagination as he might have been once. So I had to think of some framework in order to tell the story, and that actually meant that Sean O'Casey had to be in the book, although I really didn't want him to be in the book to start off with.
You also have a sort of a contrasting approach in what you write about in terms of your long fiction and your short fiction.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of psychological thriller area in the long fiction. How did that kind of fork?
It was completely unintentional. Yeah, I never set out to write a crime novel. I mean, I'm a literary fiction writer. That's my short stories are, and that's what my novel is, I dare say, as well. You know, and I was aware then that it was taking that kind of turn. I love crime fiction. I love reading crime fiction. I did a workshop down in Listowel Writers Week with Declan Hughes a few years ago.
Right.
And maybe I have him to blame, actually. Declan is wonderful, and he has so much enthusiasm and passion for his subject.
Yeah.
And, you know, he introduced us to the work of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and all of that type of thing, which I hadn't read before, you know. And I went away thinking, oh, sounds really interesting. I should start reading those type of books, and read Declan's books as well, which I absolutely loved. And Declan himself is a literary writer, you know. I mean, he was a playwright, and he's a really beautiful writer. The Wrong Kind of Blood is the first in his crime series, and
wasn't he part of the Rough Magic?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
True,
that's right. And he's an extremely literary writer, you know. So like I say, I never set out to write a crime novel. I didn't think it was a crime novel. I sent it into Inkwell, the first 3 chapters, for some analysis to Vanessa O'Loughlin a few years back with the first draft. And I spoke to Vanessa for 2 hours on the phone after that, you know, giving me feedback and advice and whatever. And one of the first things she said was, you know, she mentioned that it was a crime novel. And I said, whoa, 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 hang on a second, it's not a crime novel. And she said, yes, it is. She said, there's a body on page 1. And I said, but does that necessarily make it a crime novel, you know? Because I was thinking of all the novels that have crimes in them, but which are not crime novels.
Sure.
I actually did my PhD thesis on this, funny enough.
Yeah.
And, you know, I wrote about The Book of Evidence by John Banville, for example, The Butcher by Pat McCabe, you know, which are not crime novels, but have these heinous crimes in them, you know. So I was kind of thinking the same thing, that even though there is a crime in my book, it's not a crime novel. And then Killer Reads, the imprint of HarperCollins, opened up for submissions. And I remember seeing this on Twitter. And I said to David, oh, I wonder, should I send it in? I thought, it's not a crime novel, but look, why not, you know? And they took it on. So it was published and marketed as a crime novel. And I had mixed feelings about that, actually, because I thought, I was worried, in fact, because I thought, okay, it's a brilliant thing to get published as a crime writer, because crime is the best-selling genre, so it's certainly not going to do sales any harm, and it hasn't. The sales have been really good for it. But the other thing that concerned me was the fact that it was being marketed to a crime readership. You know, and obviously you have hardcore crime fans that are expecting wham bam on every page.
Keep it coming.
And I thought, well, my book's not really like that. It's much more evenly paced, and they may not like it, you know. And yeah, I mean, that has been quite mixed. You know, it's mostly been positive. But what I found rather interesting, because I was always afraid I was going to fall between two stools, between the literary fiction and the crime with this book, The Girl Behind the Lens. And so feedback that I got back, you know, a lot of people who love crime loved it. Some of them thought it was a bit slow. And then people who like literary fiction said, wow, it was so pacey and so exciting. And okay. So it was interesting, do you know? Exactly. Yeah. Like, you know, people who like crime sort of said it was slow burning and, you know, whatever. But yeah, literary fiction fans found it really fast.
But it's interesting, you know, how much that sort of touches on a lot of different things to do with publishing. You know, snobbery about genre.
Oh yeah, sure.
When, you know, it's what people like and buy, but also the industrial nature of publishing. It is about a product and marketing
who they can
product
market it to,
and what's the best way of doing that.
As well as that, I don't ever want to be pigeonholed as a writer into any genre. I mean, literary fiction is a genre in itself, I suppose, now, you know, but I want to have fun with writing. I love writing. I would love to write a Gothic novel. You know, I love Gothic. I don't know if I ever will, but who knows? Watch the space, But why not have fun with it and not just confine yourself to one area and one type of writing? I want to experiment and explore everything that I can as a writer.
Yeah.
Now,
going back to your most recent book, because again, in my extensive research, I came across an interview you did with Farrelly, sir, a couple of years ago about setting and sense of place. And how in your earlier writing you were less interested in having a very sort of specific locale. But this latest collection of short stories is so specific a locale, they all take place on the one street, which might not be a million miles away from the type of street you grew up in Rathgar.
Yes.
So how has that shift occurred, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe when I started out, I perhaps got confused or was mistaken about the notion of being universal and confusing the local with the parochial. And in my first book of short stories, which is set in many ways on Prosperity Drive as well, except that there's no all the place names have been removed, and it could be any suburb anywhere. And I wanted it to be like that because I thought I don't want to use the real place names, and if I make up place names, they just always sounded really Irishy and sort of wrong. And I thought I'll just make it anonymous completely. And I do think that partly it was a kind of a cultural cringe, you know, this idea that, you know, where I came from wasn't authentic enough to be named and
Yeah.
made clear, so that it had to be kind of hidden.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think partly from writing historical fiction and writing fiction that's based on real events, you get pushed into a sense of place, you know. I mean, I was writing in The Pretender, for example, about, you know, Berlin in the, you know, First World War. And, well, you have to have them living in streets in Berlin. I had to find out were those streets still
Maps
there and
yeah,
all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, by the time I got to Prosperity Drive, I thought, you know, actually, I see the experience, maybe this is the thing, I see the experience of living and coming from Prosperity Drive as being authentic. Whereas when I started off, I wanted to run a million miles from it. And I think also I wanted to get away from the place that I grew up and, you know, and I just thought nothing happens here, you know, so I have to write about something else.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, now I see, you know, the whole world was there, you know, all these stories happening.
Yeah.
I just was too, I don't know, you know,
Well, I think
foolish to see it, recognize it. You
well,
know.
you're being hard on yourself. I think we're all young and think that the grass is greener somewhere else, and it does take us a while to kind of see the value of you know, what's immediately around us. But you're making me wonder about sort of, you know, that sense of the local. And there was a recent discussion of a comment that Sally Rooney, who has just published her first novel to great acclaim, about Irish literary history being, you know, very much dominated by a particular class, you know, not necessarily European, very sort of, you know, that kind of parochiality. But that it's beginning to change. Have you been sort of conscious of that kind of a shift, of a sort of a dilution of the Irish, I suppose, or, you know, it's not just middle class writing anymore, or, you know, that kind of a shift?
Well, I mean, I don't know that. I don't know really if it has changed. I mean, I think have always been writers. You look at a writer like Don Banville, who is essentially a European writer. You know, he isn't defined by his Irishness. But then, on the other hand, you look at a writer like Donal Ryan, who is a very Irish writer and is concerned with the rural experience. Or you look at a writer like John McGahern, also completely taken up with the rural Irish experience. I don't see that it's a thing that we have to be moving away from in order to be seen to be progressive. You know, and I suppose what I'm describing to you about my journey is probably going the opposite way, and maybe that's because I'm older and wiser, and but you know, I'm not sure that. I think there's room to be a European writer and an Irish writer and to write about Ireland, without feeling that you have to give up one or be seen as kind of regressive because you're into the local.
And there was a sort of a related thing that, and it's some time ago now, I think it was 2010 when he originally said it, and it caused a bit of a spat. Julian Gough was commenting on how history obsessed the Irish writers are in particular. What's your take, Tanya? Is you know, are we obsessed?
Again, like Mary, I find it a difficult question to answer. As in, I'm not necessarily sure that the writers of today are obsessed with history, because as Mary says, yes, you've got a lot of people who are writing about small town Ireland and, you know, what life is like in the Midlands and that sort of thing, but it's not historical. Again, Mary mentioned Donal Ryan, you know, like people like Donal Ryan or Conor O'Callaghan, you know, they're updating the rural story. They're talking about, you know, ghost estates in the Midlands. They're, you know, so they're updating the rural story. And I don't think because it's rural that it's necessarily old-fashioned or, I mean, yeah, Dublin's the capital. Most of Ireland is rural, you know, so you can't get away from that. I mean, I'm from Dublin, so what I write is urban. But does it make it more modern than what's written elsewhere? I don't think so, really. You know,
And I think it comes down to, in the end, I'm a bit wary of people being didactic about this sort of thing. You write what you write, you know, or you can only write what you write.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm just wary of, you know, this is you know, my contribution to the world of writing. This is what I write about. You know, if you're not interested in that, or if you think it's too middle class or too historical, you know, read something else. But I think, you know, to say, oh, this is just, it's all backward looking, or it's all middle class, or it's all predictable, you know, first of all, I think, you know, it presupposes that the person who's making the criticism is none of these things, you know. And I mean,
it's realism. And isn't that what literary fiction is, really?
Yeah.
You know, it's realistic, it's reflecting life. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a good time to maybe try and hear some literary fiction. So both of you have brought something to read.
Yeah.
So maybe, Tanya, can we ask you?
Okay,
first?
yeah, sure. So I'll just read the beginning of one of the short stories. It's called The Prodigal. This was shortlisted for the Francis McManus Awards 2 years ago. So I'll just read a short extract. My brother has come home after an absence of 7 years. His tall, thin frame hovers in the doorway, an unlit cigarette dangling between his tobacco-stained fingers as his eyes flick about the room and focus on nothing in particular. I can't help but wonder if he's noticed the absence of ceremony that accompanies his return. There are no colourful balloons strung from the balustrade. No welcome home banner brushes the top of Christian's head as he enters our living room. Instead, his return is met with anxious glances and 2 bright smiles. My voice is an octave too loud and betrays that this is not the kind of reunion that I desire. Christian's been clutching that cigarette since he got into the car. Reason tells me that he's dying to light it, but that he's too polite or preoccupied to ask. As he enters the room, I find myself babbling about the new decking that we got earlier in the summer. I swing open the back door, forgetting about Jess, our 5-month-old collie, who flies at the newcomer before he's even got through the door. Christian puts the cigarette in his mouth and stoops to fondle the dog's ears, relieved perhaps by the first genuine greeting he's received all day. And I remember that my brother has always loved dogs, and that each dog we've ever had has sworn its allegiance to him. I look at Jess now, feeling slightly betrayed, and question her judgment of character. I don't suppose you've a light. The cigarette jigs up and down as Christian speaks. Matter of fact, I do, I say. Barry's a chain smoker. I return to the kitchen and stand on the first rung of a stool to retrieve a lighter from the top shelf of the cupboard where we keep it out of Emily's reach. I've learned over the years what not to leave around a small child. When I get down from the stool, I linger in the kitchen and watch as my brother picks up a stone and with a deft movement of the wrist sends it hurtling down the garden. Jess barks and bounds after it, skidding to a halt by the gazebo. She looks back and pants happily at her new friend, her mouth open in what looks like a wide grin. I toss Christian the lighter and tell him that I'll show him his room when he's ready. I stand behind my brother for a few minutes, but he doesn't say anything, and I go back inside to start the evening meal, leaving him leaning over the decking, puffing on his cigarette with the dog prostrate at his feet. The light has faded by the time Christian comes in. I'm at the sink peeling and chopping vegetables, and I don't hear him come up behind me. When I turn and see him standing close by, I give a start and then laugh to try to conceal my all too real anxiety. I didn't hear you come in, I say. Christian ignores my uneasiness and asks if he can help with something. I wipe my hands on the tea towel, smile broadly, and tell him that everything's under control. He stands close to me, and I get the faint smell of perspiration rising from beneath his tin cotton shirt. Come on, I'll show you where you're sleeping. I give him a wide berth as I pass, and he follows me like the collie to the bottom of the stairs. In Emily's room, I reach for the light. Christian looks around. I see him take in the doll's house, the army of stuffed toys, button eyes glowing in the harsh electric light, and Emily's Hannah Montana posters pinned to the wall. He puts his bag at the end of the bed and runs a hand over the soft pink quilt. I hope you don't mind sleeping in Emily's room, I say. We'd nowhere else to put you. Christian shakes his head. And what about Emily? He asks. She'll sleep in with us. God knows she does it most nights anyway. I tell him about my daughter's fear of the dark, and he says that she must take after her mother, reminding me that I was always afraid of the monsters that lurked beneath the bed. He pats the quilt, sits unmoving, and waits for me to leave. I tell him that I'll leave him to settle in, but in the doorway I pause and turn. Christian, I am sorry about Helen, I say. He nods, and his eyes look glassy.
Well done. Well done. And Mary, please. Listen from you.
This is from a story called Miss Ireland. It's historical. The maid stuck her head in the gas oven one Sunday afternoon in the Devoy house, 27 Prosperity Drive, but not before she had fed and changed the baby, Farrelly it was, and put him down for his nap. The family was out visiting Nana Devoy, as they always did after second mass, and the maid had timed it, or so Betty Fortune had heard, so the deed would be done before they got back, and before Farrelly woke again. She had put soaking towels in the gap between the kitchen door and the floor so that the fumes would not escape into the rest of the house, and left a scrawled note pinned to the kitchen door saying, "Danger, keep out." There was a deadly precision to the arrangement, a precision Irene Devoy had never noticed in the girl before, though she didn't voice this, not wanting to speak ill of the dead. She wanted everything about the terrible scandal that had been visited upon her household to be proper, because what Irene felt deep in her heart about the suicide of the maid was selfish relief. Liam had suggested the maid. She can deal with the baby, the night feeds, and help out with the chores, etc., etc., Liam had said. Etc. was a phrase he used a lot, and it covered a multitude. But Irene couldn't complain. Liam was a good provider. With a new baby in the house, he was worried about Irene losing her beauty sleep, as he called it. That was why Quinny was hired in the first place. Of course, she wasn't Quinny when she came. She was Marguerite Quinn, recommended by a colleague of Liam's in Public Works. She was a country girl, as all these maids were, and on first sight Irene's heart took a dive. She expected someone mousy and cowed, but Quinny was a big girl, big-boned, that is, with breasts and curves, sheathed in a black Brine Island polo, a skirt in houndstooth check tight around the beam end, and black stockings with, Irene noticed, a ladder stopped above the knee with nail polish. She wore kitten heels. She had long auburn hair, long enough to sit on, which delighted the boys, and brown eyes, large and placid. And she had a beauty spot, pasted high on her pale cheekbone. The only way in which she satisfied Irene's expectations was in her accent, flat and tinkerish. She called Irene Mrs. "Where have you been working before this?" Irene asked her. "Worked for a lord in the County Meath, Mrs., in a castle with a moat and all, but I was let go." "Oh." Irene felt a tiny tremor of alarm. She waited for an explanation, but the girl offered none. "Well, we don't have a castle here," Irene said, laughing nervously as she showed Quinny the box room in the back that they'd cleared for her and the baby. With the cot in there, it looked poky, and the sun went in just at that moment, so it took on a dingy air. Irene was about to apologise. Then she thought better of it. This was a maid, for God's sake. "Now, come and meet the boys."
Brilliant. Well done. So what are you both working on? Tanya, you've got one due April
I'm
next
working
year?
on a crime novel.
April. Another one of the killer
This time I
reads?
am working on a crime novel. Yeah. So the first time it was unintentional. This time it is intentional. So yeah, it's coming out of Killer Reads with HarperCollins again. So that'll be out April or May next year.
So you have to have the manuscript done
I have to have the first draft done by the end of November. So I'm almost done actually.
Gosh, that's a quick turnaround from first draft to actually...
It is and it's not, because I'd actually begun this novel before The Girl Behind the Lens was published.
Okay.
And then I decided to leave it
Yeah.
and go back and do more work on The Girl Behind the Lens. So it was something then that I was returning to, you know, yeah.
And Mary, what are you on?
I'm about halfway through a first draft of a novel, which is going rather more slowly than it should be. Partly, I think, because having gone back to the short story, I'm still dabbling, doing what Tanya doesn't do, and probably I shouldn't do, that I keep on thinking, oh, I'll just do one. I have 2 or 3 ideas here, you know, and of course,
You
you
get
know, with
distracted.
ideas.
Well,
they
to be
don't-
honest, I did write a few short stories before I went back to the
Oh,
second
yeah.
novel, yeah.
But like the ideas don't go away, but you know,
Yeah.
it's just I was itching to do them. So, but I think it is actually better, as you say. I'm a bit
Just to
like
stick
that,
with
to
it,
stick with
yeah.
one, because, you know, particularly I think with a novel that you really need to be steeped in the world of it.
Yeah.
And if you're sort of flitting out to do short fiction, you know,
And
it's harder.
Does the academic year get in the way as well? I mean, do you find that abandon all hope during October to June?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's not so much time. I think it's kind of headspace. That and I think particularly too with a novel that you sort of need a run of time at it. And, you know, it's much easier to write short fiction in short bursts. You know, you can fit it in around other things, you know.
Yeah.
But the novel requires the, you know, the head down commitment, I think.
Yeah.
Well, we're looking forward, whenever it appears, to reading it. And thank you both very much for coming and talking to us. Delightful conversation about fiction with Tanya Farrelly and Mary Morrissy. So thank you for watching. We will be back next month with possibly something specially seasonal. We shall see. But thanks again, Mary and Tanya, for talking to us, and thank you for watching.
Yes, I know that I'm just a dreamer. I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.